The courtroom was thick with tension, the kind that made even the air feel heavy. Wooden benches creaked under the weight of people leaning forward, curious eyes fixed on the boy standing at the front. Daniel Carter, only 17, stood stiffly, his shoulders squared but trembling. His jaw clenched as though he were forcing himself not to break. The judge's gavel had just come down, silencing the murmurs, when a desperate cry cut through the room. "Please, don't do this to my brother." The voice belonged to a little girl, small in frame but filled with raw defiance. Emily Carter, just 9 years old, had sprung up from the bench where she sat with her mother. Her wide eyes glistened with tears, and her small hands balled into fists. The plea wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't calculated. It was the voice of a child who believed the world had to listen when truth was on her side. Heads turned. Some spectators scoffed, others felt their hearts twist. The judge frowned, his gavel raised as if to strike again. But before he could, another voice, loud, commanding, carrying authority like thunder, echoed through the room. "That's enough!" The doors at the back had swung open, and there he was, Richard Hale. His suit was sharp, his steps purposeful, and though he was known in town as the millionaire who had left years ago to build his empire, no one expected him here, now, in this courtroom. He strode forward, his gaze fixed not on the judge or the jury, but directly on Daniel. "This is wrong," Richard said firmly, pointing toward the boy, "and I won't stand by and watch it happen." A ripple of gasps spread across the courtroom. Some whispered his name like a secret, others stared as if unsure what game he was playing. Daniel's mother, Linda, clutched Emily's hand, her confusion written plain across her tired face. Daniel himself blinked in disbelief, caught between fear and a fragile spark of hope. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Hale, this is highly irregular." "Maybe so," Richard countered, his voice steady. "But irregular doesn't mean unjustified. I know what it feels like to be standing where that boy is right now. And I won't let this proceed without being heard." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Emily's small sniffles as she wiped her face. At that moment, something shifted. It wasn't just about Daniel anymore. It was about the weight of truth, about the courage of a child, and the intervention of a man who, for reasons unknown, decided to step into a storm that wasn't his to weather. And it's right here where we invite you to join us on this journey. If stories of courage, injustice, and unexpected redemption move you as much as they move us, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now. That way, you won't miss the unfolding of this incredible story. Because what began as a desperate plea from a little girl was about to become a battle for truth that would shake an entire town. Daniel shifted his feet, the weight of eyes upon him almost unbearable. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, but his throat was dry, locked by the fear of being dismissed, of no one believing him. He glanced at his sister, whose fierce expression gave him strength. In her eyes, he wasn't guilty. He wasn't weak. He was her protector, her brother, the person she believed in with all her heart. Richard Hale's presence was more than a disruption. It was a promise unspoken, a spark of resistance in a room where defeat felt inevitable. But why had he come? Why Daniel? And what storm of secrets did his sudden arrival carry with it? The gavel struck again, demanding order, but beneath the surface the courtroom no longer felt in control. Something larger had been set in motion, and no one, not the judge, not the jury, not even Richard himself, could predict how far it would go. And as the eyes of the town bore down on Daniel Carter, the boy accused of a crime he swore he didn't commit, his heart pounded with the faintest whisper of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the truth had found a voice. The Carters lived in a modest 2-bedroom house at the edge of town, where cracked sidewalks led to neighbors who knew each other's names, but rarely crossed each other's thresholds. It wasn't the kind of home that drew envy, but it was sturdy enough to shelter a family trying to hold itself together after too many storms. Daniel Carter had grown up in that house, the eldest child with responsibilities that far outweighed his years. Since his father's passing, he had become more than just a brother. He had become a quiet guardian. Every morning he woke before dawn, tying the laces of worn-out sneakers before heading to his shift at the local diner. The smell of bacon grease clung to his shirts, and his hands were often red from scrubbing dishes, but he never complained. At school, Daniel wasn't the kind of student who made headlines or carried trophies. He kept his head down, focused on finishing assignments and slipping out before anyone could ask too many questions. Teachers admired his persistence, though some pitied the shadow of exhaustion beneath his eyes. To his classmates, he was dependable but distant, someone who didn't join weekend parties or football games because his evenings were filled with shifts at the diner and the promise he had made to himself, to keep Emily safe. Emily was his anchor. She was only 9, but her bright chatter filled the silence their father had left behind. Daniel often helped her with homework at the kitchen table, patient even when his own fatigue threatened to close his eyes. Sometimes she would draw pictures of him in her school notebooks, stick figures with broad shoulders, always standing beside a smaller girl with a smile. "That's us," she'd say proudly, showing him, and he'd smile back, warmed by the knowledge that, in her eyes, he was enough. Their mother, Linda, carried her own burdens. She worked double shifts at the nursing home across town, her back aching from lifting patients, her voice hoarse by the time she returned home late at night. Daniel often caught her staring at the empty chair at the dinner table where his father once sat, her expression a mix of strength and sorrow. Still, she pushed forward, reminding them daily that family was worth every sacrifice. Yet life in a small Ohio town wasn't always kind. People noticed Daniel's patched-up jeans, the way Linda's old car rattled down Main Street. Some admired the Carters for their resilience, but others whispered behind hands, quick to judge poverty as laziness. Daniel heard the whispers, though he rarely responded. Instead, he channeled his frustration into work, determined to one day rise above the narrow limits people tried to place on him. The construction job had been part of that effort. During summer, he took shifts carrying lumber and hauling equipment for a foreman who barely looked at him. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid better than the diner. Daniel dreamed of saving enough to apply to community college, maybe study mechanics or engineering. He never voiced it much. Dreams felt fragile when spoken aloud, but in quiet moments, the thought pushed him forward. At times, though, the weight of responsibility pressed down harder than he could bear. Walking home late at night, Daniel often felt torn between exhaustion and determination. He wanted to be a normal teenager, free to laugh with friends and waste hours at the mall, but reality had demanded a different version of him. He had accepted it, though sometimes he caught himself wondering if the town would ever see him as more than the boy with tired eyes and calloused hands. Emily never doubted. "You're the strongest person I know," she once whispered to him as he tucked her into bed. He chuckled softly, brushing back her hair. "Strong enough to lift mountains," he teased. She shook her head, serious. "Strong enough to lift me." It was moments like that which gave Daniel the courage to keep pushing, even when the odds stacked against him. And though he didn't know it yet, those odds were about to turn into something far heavier than late-night shifts and whispered gossip. The summer had been stifling, the kind of heat that clung to skin and made tempers short. Daniel had spent most of it hauling beams, sweeping sawdust and following orders barked by men twice his age. The construction site was noisy and unforgiving, but he never complained. Every paycheck meant groceries on the table and maybe a little saved for his dream of college. It was near the end of August when everything changed. One Monday morning, Daniel walked to the diner for his usual shift, only to find 2 police officers waiting near the entrance. Their cruiser sat on the curb, lights off but presence undeniable. Daniel froze when they stepped toward him. "Daniel Carter," one of them asked, his tone clipped. "Yes, sir," Daniel answered cautiously, clutching the strap of his backpack. "You're coming with us. We need to ask you some questions about the theft at the construction site." The words hit him like a punch. Theft? His mind scrambled, trying to connect the dots. I don't know anything about that," he stammered. The officer didn't soften. "You were the last one seen there on Saturday night. Some equipment went missing. We just need to clear a few things up." As they led him to the cruiser, Daniel's stomach knotted. He remembered Saturday clearly. He had stayed late to sweep up, the foreman muttering about leaving things tidy. Daniel had been exhausted, dragging his feet home under the streetlights. But now, suddenly, He was the suspect. At home, Linda nearly collapsed when she heard the news. Emily clung to her side, her small face pale with fear. "He didn't do anything," Emily cried, her voice high and trembling. "He would never steal." Linda pulled her daughter close, fighting her own panic. "We know that," she whispered, her voice breaking. "We know." The town reacted quickly, as small towns often do, fast to judge, faster to spread rumors. At the diner, Daniel's boss frowned deeply, saying, "I can't have trouble around here, son." The words stung, even before Daniel realized it meant he was being let go. At the grocery store, Linda noticed stares that lingered too long. Whispers followed them down aisles, fragments of sentences floating like sharp edges. Shame. Poor family. Should have known better. Daniel kept insisting he was innocent, his voice raw with frustration. "I was just working, Mom. I locked up and left. That's all I did." Linda cupped his face, trying to reassure him. "We'll figure this out. The truth always comes out." But even she looked tired, worn down by the weight pressing against them. The evidence mounted quickly. A set of footprints near the shed matched Daniel's sneakers. A witness claimed to have seen someone his height leaving the site. To the sheriff's department it seemed open and shut. For Daniel, it felt like the world had decided his guilt before he even had a chance to breathe. Emily, however, refused to accept it. One evening she stood in front of her brother with fists clenched, her chin lifted in determination. "They're wrong, Danny. I know it. You're good and they can't take that away from us." He tried to smile, though his heart was heavy. "I hope you're right, Em." Her eyes flashed. "No, I don't hope, I know." It was that unwavering certainty from his little sister that kept Daniel from falling apart completely. Still, the days stretched on with unbearable weight, each one bringing them closer to a courtroom where strangers would decide his fate. When the summons finally came, Linda folded it carefully, her hands trembling. The trial date was set. Their modest kitchen felt colder that night, the hum of the refrigerator louder than usual, as if even the house understood what was coming. Daniel sat quietly, staring at the worn wood of the table. "Why me?" he whispered, not to anyone in particular. "Why are they doing this to me?" No one had an answer. But deep down, all three Carters knew this was only the beginning of a battle they never asked for. The name Richard Hale had always lingered in the background of the town's conversations, spoken with a mix of admiration and envy. He was the boy who'd once mowed lawns on Maple Street, who used to fix bikes in his parents' garage for a few extra dollars. But decades later, he had left Ohio and turned himself into something bigger than anyone could have predicted. By the time Daniel Carter was born, Richard's name was tied to skyscrapers in New York and business deals splashed across financial newspapers. People in town still pointed to the old Hale house and said, "That's where he started," though the place now sat empty, shutters closed and garden wild. Yet no one could have expected him to appear at Daniel's hearing. He wasn't a man who came back often. Rumors said he had cut ties with the town long ago, unwilling to be dragged down by its narrow judgments. Which made it all the more shocking when his footsteps echoed across the courtroom floor, his polished shoes striking firmly against the wood, his voice carrying authority that silenced even the judge. Daniel, still stunned from the accusation, looked at him as though he were a figure from another world. The suit, the commanding presence, the certainty in his words, everything about Richard seemed untouchable. And yet he wasn't addressing the wealthy or the powerful. His attention was on Daniel, the boy who stood trembling at the defense table. "I won't stand by and watch this," Richard declared, his gaze steady. "I know what it feels like to be accused when you've done nothing wrong. And I know how easily a lie can destroy a life." The words hung in the air. Murmurs swept across the benches, neighbors whispering questions they had no answers to. The judge cleared his throat, struggling to assert control. "Mr. Hale, this is highly unusual. The court—" "I understand," Richard cut in, his tone respectful but firm. "But sometimes unusual is necessary when justice is at stake." Daniel's heart pounded. He didn't know this man. He had never spoken to him, never even expected to. But in that moment, he felt a strange flicker of relief, as though someone larger than the system had chosen to stand at his side. Emily leaned close to her mother, whispering fiercely, "See, Mom? Somebody believes him." Linda squeezed her daughter's hand, though uncertainty clouded her features. What did this man want with her son? What could possibly tie the fate of a millionaire to a boy accused of theft in a small Ohio town? After the hearing was adjourned for the day, Richard approached the Carters in the courthouse hallway. His presence filled the narrow space, but his voice softened. "Daniel, I see myself in you. Years ago I was accused of stealing from a store I worked at. I didn't have the means to defend myself, and though I was cleared eventually, the damage followed me for years. People looked at me differently, even when the truth came out. I won't let that happen to you." Daniel swallowed hard, his voice quiet. "But why me? You don't even know me." Richard paused, his expression pensive. "Because no one did that for me, and if I can change the story for someone else, I will." Emily's eyes shone with gratitude, but Linda remained guarded. "Mr. Hale, we don't want charity. We just want fairness." "That's exactly what I'm offering," Richard replied evenly. "Fairness. I'll cover the cost of a defense lawyer who will actually fight for Daniel, but I need you to trust me." The offer seemed too large, almost unreal. Linda looked at her son, then at Emily, her hands trembling as she weighed the risk. Daniel met Richard's gaze. There was something steady there, something that cut through the noise of accusation and rumor. And for the first time since the nightmare had begun, Daniel felt like maybe the tide could shift. But beneath that fragile hope, questions lingered. Why had Richard chosen him? And what ghosts from his past had drawn him back to a town he'd left behind so long ago? News of Richard Hale's intervention spread faster than wildfire. In a town where everyone knew everyone's business, it didn't take long for whispers to curl through diner booths, grocery aisles, and pews at Sunday service. Some called it an act of mercy, a sign that the boy deserved another chance. Others muttered darker theories, convinced the millionaire was only here to polish his image or to settle some hidden debt. At the hardware store, two older men leaned on the counter, their conversation low but sharp. "Did you hear? Hale's backing that Carter boy." "Yeah, and why would a man like him bother with some kid accused of stealing? Doesn't smell right." "Maybe he's trying to buy himself a little redemption." You don't get that rich without stepping on people. Meanwhile, at the diner where Daniel used to work, the mood was split. Martha, the waitress who had known him since he was a boy, shook her head firmly. "Daniel's a good kid, always polite, never short on his work. If Mr. Hale's willing to stand by him, that tells me something." But her co-worker, Tony, snorted. "Or it tells you the kid's guilty and Hale just wants the spotlight. You really think rich folks do things out of kindness?" For Linda, the attention was suffocating. She walked into the grocery store with Emily and felt eyes track her down the produce aisle. A woman she barely knew leaned close, whispering, "You must be so relieved to have Mr. Hale on your side." Her tone carried both envy and suspicion. Linda forced a tight smile, clutching the basket until her knuckles whitened. When she returned home, she sank into a chair, muttering, "They don't see us. They just see gossip." Emily, however, seemed unshaken by the storm. She looked up at her mother with innocent certainty. "It doesn't matter what they say. Mr. Hale believes in Danny. That means the truth will come out." Her small voice, so full of conviction, gave Linda the strength to hold back tears. At school, Daniel faced the hardest reactions. Some students who once nodded at him in the hall now turned away, their whispers slicing through him as he passed. "That's him," one boy muttered. "Got the millionaire to cover for him?" Another girl scoffed. "Rich people only help when it benefits them. Just wait. He'll drop him." Daniel clenched his fists, jaw tight, but he refused to lash out. Inside, though, the weight of their judgment pressed heavy. He wondered if even the truth would be enough to erase the stain of suspicion. Still, a few stood by him quietly. Megan, the sheriff's daughter, gave him a small nod one afternoon in the hallway. It wasn't much, but it reminded him he wasn't entirely alone. At the courthouse, the officials reacted with unease. The sheriff grumbled privately to a deputy, "Last thing we need is Hale meddling. Makes it look like we don't know how to do our jobs." The deputy shrugged. Or maybe it means we should look closer before we hang this kid. The sheriff's glare ended the conversation, but doubt had already been planted. Richard himself didn't waver. He stayed in town longer than anyone expected, his sleek car parked outside the modest inn near Main Street. Some saw it as arrogance, others as commitment. Daniel, still uncertain of this sudden benefactor, couldn't shake the question gnawing at him. Why was this powerful man risking so much for him? One evening, Daniel sat on the porch steps, staring at the quiet street. Emily plopped down beside him, her hair tangled from play. "They're all talking, huh?" she said softly. "Yeah," Daniel replied, his voice low. "Feels like everyone's made up their minds already," she nudged his arm. "Not everyone, I haven't, Mom hasn't, and Mr. Hale definitely hasn't. That's enough, isn't it?" Daniel looked at her, her eyes wide and steady, and for a moment the storm outside felt just a little less heavy. Still, he knew the battle ahead wasn't just about the truth. It was about surviving the weight of a town that wasn't sure it wanted to believe in him. Richard Hale wasted no time after stepping into Daniel's life. Within days, he had arranged a meeting with a lawyer whose reputation preceded her. Sarah Mitchell wasn't flashy or famous, but she was known across Ohio as someone who fought tooth and nail for people without power. She was sharp-eyed, quick-witted, and had a way of making judges pause before dismissing her arguments. When Sarah first sat down with Daniel in the Carters' modest living room, she studied him with a calm intensity. Her legal pad rested on her knees, pen poised. "I don't need the version of events you've been rehearsing for others," she said. "I need the truth, all of it. Every detail, even the ones that might seem unimportant." Daniel hesitated, hands twisting together. "I've already told the police. I worked late. I swept up like the foreman asked, locked the gate, and walked home. That's it." Sarah leaned forward slightly. "And did anyone see you leave?" Daniel shook his head. "Not that I know of. The site was empty. Everyone else had gone home hours earlier." Richard, seated nearby, folded his arms. "Think, son, anything out of place? Anything you noticed that night?" Daniel closed his eyes, trying to recall. The memory of that evening was tangled with exhaustion. "The shed door," he said finally. "I thought it was odd. It was cracked open when I arrived, but I figured someone had just forgotten to shut it. I closed it before I left." Sarah scribbled the note quickly. "And the missing equipment, they say it was from that shed." Daniel's heart raced. "But I didn't take it. I didn't even go back in there. I locked the gate and walked straight home." Sarah gave him a long look, then nodded. "That's what we're going to prove, but understand, Daniel, right now the evidence isn't in your favor. Your footprints, your timing, a witness claiming they saw you near the site. We have to show that someone wanted this to point to you." Emily, sitting cross-legged on the rug, piped up with childlike certainty. "Because they're lying. They just don't want to admit who really did it." Sarah's stern features softened slightly as she looked at the little girl. "Maybe you're right. But the law doesn't work on belief alone. We'll need facts." The days that followed became a blur of searching. Sarah requested work logs, payroll records, and security footage from nearby businesses. Richard used his connections to put pressure on officials who dragged their feet. Still, obstacles appeared at every turn. The site had no working cameras. The foreman insisted Daniel was the last person around, and the supposed witness, a neighbor across the street, stood by their claim. One evening, Sarah spread out papers across the Carters' kitchen table. "Look here," she said, pointing to the timesheets. 2 men signed out equipment hours before Daniel even arrived for his shift. Yet no one asked them where that equipment went. "Why?" Daniel leaned over, frustration bubbling in his chest. "Because it's easier to blame me." Richard's voice was low but firm. "Then we'll make it harder. We'll show the holes in their story until they can't ignore them." For the first time, Daniel felt the stirrings of a fight he might actually win. Still, fear gnawed at him. What if no one cared about the holes? What if the town simply wanted a culprit, and he was the easiest one to name? Late that night, when the house had gone quiet, Daniel sat at the window with Emily beside him. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "You'll see," she whispered sleepily. "They can't keep lying forever." Daniel looked out at the still street, the hum of cicadas filling the night. He wanted to believe her. He needed to. Because if Sarah and Richard couldn't uncover the truth, then the weight of a lie might crush him before anyone even cared to listen. The investigation brought brief flickers of hope, but for every lead Sarah uncovered, a wall seemed to rise just as quickly. The Carters soon realized that truth was not a simple path, but a maze filled with shadows, and Daniel found himself walking deeper into it with each passing day. At school, the air grew colder around him. Friends who once greeted him with nods now avoided his eyes. In the cafeteria, whispers followed him like a shadow. "That's him!" someone hissed. The thief. Daniel sat alone at a corner table, staring at his tray until the food blurred. The sting wasn't just in their words, but in the silence of those who didn't defend him. Even teachers, though polite, seemed to watch him differently, as if waiting for him to confirm the rumors. One afternoon, a boy from the construction crew caught him by the lockers. "Enjoying your new sponsor?" the boy sneered. "Guess it pays to have a millionaire in your pocket." Daniel's fists tightened at his sides, but he forced himself not to swing. Instead, he muttered, "You don't know anything," and walked away, though anger burned hot under his skin. At home, things weren't easier. Linda came back from work one night, shoulders slumped, eyes glassy with fatigue. She sat heavily at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of unpaid bills. "They cut my hours," she whispered, almost to herself. "Said the nursing home doesn't need as much help this month." But Daniel heard the truth beneath her words. She was being edged out because of the whispers about her son. "I'll pick up extra shifts at the diner," Daniel offered quickly, forgetting he no longer worked there. The words slipped out like a reflex, and the silence that followed was heavy. He lowered his head. "I'll find something else. Anything." Emily, sitting nearby with her homework spread out, slammed her pencil down. "It's not fair. None of this is fair." "Why do they all hate us for something Danny didn't even do?" Linda reached out, brushing her daughter's hair back gently. "People believe what's easiest to believe, sweetheart, and right now, it's easier for them to blame than to think." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled. Daniel felt the weight of her words pressing into his chest. He wanted to protect his mother, his sister, to shield them from the cruelty of a town that had once nodded at him kindly. But he couldn't. Not this time. Richard and Sarah continued their work, but even their presence stirred doubts. Some townsfolk accused Richard of trying to play hero for publicity, while others whispered that Sarah only took the case for the paycheck. Daniel overheard one neighbor mutter, "They'll drop him the moment it gets too hard, just watch." The words clawed at his mind late at night. What if they were right? What if Richard's interest faded, leaving him stranded? What if Sarah moved on to another case, one easier to win? Lying awake in the dark, Daniel stared at the ceiling, his thoughts loud in the silence. "What if I can't beat this?" he whispered to himself. "What if this is who I am now, the thief, the outcast?" Emily, who had crept into his room after another nightmare, rolled over sleepily and placed her small hand on his arm. "You're not that," she mumbled. "You're my brother. That's all that matters." Her words soothed him, but only for a moment. Because as much as Emily's faith kept him standing, doubt still gnawed at him, whispering that faith might not be enough against the tide of suspicion. Everywhere he turned, Daniel faced walls built by gossip, by fear, by prejudice. And though Richard and Sarah pressed forward with determination, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in, ready to swallow him whole. The week dragged on, with Daniel carrying the weight of suspicion wherever he went. Yet in the middle of his darkest days, a faint light appeared from an unexpected place. It began at school, in the crowded hallway, buzzing with chatter and slamming lockers. Daniel walked with his head down, trying to avoid the stairs, when he heard a quiet voice behind him. "Hey, Daniel, wait up." He turned, surprised to see Megan Collins, the sheriff's daughter. She wasn't someone he knew well. Their conversations had never gone beyond polite greetings. Her father, Sheriff Collins, was one of the men most convinced of Daniel's guilt. That fact alone made her approach startling. "What do you want?" Daniel asked cautiously, his voice edged with weariness. Megan shifted her backpack, her eyes flicking around to make sure no one was listening. I think they're wrong about you. Daniel blinked, taken aback. You... what? I don't believe you stole anything, she said firmly. I heard my dad talking at home. He's convinced it was you because it fits too easily. But that's just it. It's too easy. Nothing about it makes sense. For the first time in weeks, Daniel felt a glimmer of validation from someone outside his family. Why are you telling me this? If your dad finds out... I don't care, Megan interrupted. Her tone was steady, though her fingers twisted nervously around her sleeve. I know what it's like to be judged by someone else's mistakes. My brother got in trouble a few years ago, and people treated me like I was guilty too. I'm not going to let that happen to you without at least trying to help. That afternoon, Megan joined Daniel and Emily on the porch of the Carter house. Emily's face lit up instantly. You believe him too? She asked eagerly. Yes, Megan answered without hesitation. And I think I might have something that could help. She explained how she had overheard a conversation between her father and one of the deputies. The foreman at the construction site, Mr. Davis, had been struggling financially. Word was he owed money to a supplier, and there were rumors about him cutting corners. It sounded like there's more going on than anyone wants to admit, Megan said. And if he's desperate, that could mean he set this whole thing up. Daniel's eyes widened. You're saying he framed me? I don't know for sure, Megan admitted, but it wouldn't be the first time someone used an easy target to cover their tracks. Emily clenched her fists, her voice fierce. We have to tell Ms. Mitchell. She'll know what to do. Megan smiled faintly at the little girl's determination. That's the plan, but we need to be careful. If my dad finds out I'm snooping, it'll get complicated fast. For the first time in days, the Carters felt like the tide might be shifting, however slightly. Daniel sat back against the porch railing, staring out at the fading sunlight. Relief mixed with caution inside him. Thank you, he said quietly. I don't know why you'd risk helping me, but thank you. Megan met his gaze, her expression earnest. Because sometimes the truth needs a push, and because I know what it feels like to be on the outside looking in. You don't deserve this. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay awake, listening to the soft breathing of Emily in the next room, his thoughts racing. Megan's words replayed in his mind. For the first time since the nightmare began, he wasn't just standing against the tide alone. Someone outside his family believed in him, someone willing to take a risk. It didn't erase the doubts or the weight of the accusations pressing on his shoulders. But it was enough to kindle a fragile spark of hope. And hope, Daniel realized, might be the only thing strong enough to keep him moving forward through the storm. Richard Hale had become a fixture in the Carters' lives, though none of them fully understood why. His car appeared outside their small house almost daily, his crisp suits out of place against the peeling paint of the porch. He never complained about the modest surroundings, never showed the discomfort that wealthy men often carried into working-class spaces. Still, the question lingered unspoken. What did he really want? One evening, Linda finally asked. The children were asleep, and Richard sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee untouched before him. The dim light highlighted the sharp lines of his face, his expression caught somewhere between exhaustion and determination. Mr. Hale, Linda began, her voice steady despite the unease gnawing at her. Why are you doing this? My son is grateful. We all are. But I can't help but wonder, what's in this for you? Richard set the cup down carefully, his gaze fixed on the wood grain of the table. For a long moment he said nothing, as though he were weighing the cost of telling the truth. Finally he spoke. When I was about Daniel's age, I was working at a corner store here in town. One night, the register came up short. They accused me of stealing. I swore I hadn't, but nobody wanted to believe the kid from a poor family. They fired me, spread the word, and for years after that, people treated me like I was untrustworthy. Even after it came out that the manager had been skimming money, the damage was done. I left this town carrying a name I hadn't earned. Linda's eyes softened, though her arms stayed folded tightly. So you see him as yourself? Richard nodded slowly. I know what it feels like to stand alone, condemned before the truth has even been heard. And I know how those scars last. I built everything I have with those whispers chasing me, always reminding me that people are quicker to condemn than to forgive." He exhaled heavily. "When I saw Daniel in that courtroom, it was like looking at a reflection of my past." I couldn't walk away. The room was quiet, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. Linda searched his face, looking for cracks in his conviction. "And what about the talk in town? People say you're only here for publicity, or to clear your own conscience." Richard's jaw tightened. "Let them talk. They always will. But my motives don't change the fact that Daniel deserves a fair fight. If I can help him avoid the mistakes that haunted me, then it's worth every whisper behind my back." The next day, Daniel found himself alone with Richard for the first time since that conversation. They walked along the sidewalk, autumn leaves crunching underfoot. Daniel kicked at a stray pebble, his thoughts heavy. "You don't have to do this, you know," he said finally, his voice low. "You don't owe me anything." Richard glanced at him, his eyes shadowed by something deeper than pity. "You're right. I don't owe you. But I owe the boy I used to be, the one no one fought for. Helping you is how I finally fight for him." Daniel swallowed hard, unsure what to say. There was something raw in Richard's words, something that made him realize the man's wealth and power hadn't erased the wounds of his youth. For the first time, Daniel understood that Richard wasn't saving him out of charity. He was chasing redemption of his own. Later that night, as Daniel lay in bed, he replayed the conversation in his head. Richard's motives were clearer now, yet questions still lingered. Could a man really bury decades of pain by saving someone else? And would Richard still stand by him when the trial grew harder, when the town's whispers turned into shouts? Daniel didn't know the answers, but one thing was certain. Richard Hale wasn't just a benefactor anymore. He was a man fighting his own ghosts, and their fates were becoming dangerously intertwined. The closer the trial drew, the heavier the pressure became. Sarah Mitchell pushed harder than ever, her office stacked with files and documents as she dug through every possible angle. Late nights stretched into early mornings, her determination unwavering. But with each breakthrough, another obstacle rose to block their path. One afternoon, Sarah called the Carters and Richard into her office. Her desk was cluttered with reports, her expression tight. "We've got something," she said, tapping a stack of papers. "Bank records. The foreman, Mr. Davis, took out a loan he couldn't repay. The timing lines up perfectly with the theft. If he sold that equipment, it would explain everything." Daniel's chest tightened with cautious relief. "So this proves it wasn't me." Sarah shook her head. "It points away from you, but it doesn't prove anything yet. We'll need to tie him directly to the missing equipment. Otherwise, it's just circumstantial." Richard leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Then we find the connection. If he sold it, there's a trail, buyers, receipts, something. Men like him don't operate cleanly." But just when the case seemed to shift in their favor, new problems surfaced. A fresh statement arrived from another supposed witness, this one claiming they had seen Daniel near the construction site at midnight, hours later than his story. The statement was riddled with inconsistencies, but it gave the prosecution fresh ammunition. Linda's face paled as Sarah read the document aloud. "This is a lie," she whispered. "He was home. I remember hearing him come in." Daniel's frustration boiled over. "Why do they keep making things up? Don't they care about the truth?" Sarah's voice was calm but firm. "The truth doesn't always matter to people who want an easy answer, but it will matter in court. Our job is to show the judge that their story falls apart under scrutiny." Still, the strain on the family deepened. At the grocery store, Linda overheard two women muttering, "Doesn't matter what the lawyer says, once a thief, always a thief." She walked out without finishing her shopping, her hands trembling as she gripped the steering wheel. At school, Daniel's locker was vandalized with the word liar scrawled across it in marker. He scrubbed at it furiously, his throat burning with anger. Megan appeared beside him, helping without a word. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. "They're scared of the truth, Daniel. That's why they're trying so hard to shut you down." Richard, meanwhile, faced his own battles. Word of his involvement with Daniel spread beyond the town, reaching his business associates. Calls came from New York, voices sharp with concern. "This case is messy, Richard. It doesn't look good for you. Investors don't want their money tied to a man defending a criminal." He responded with the same cold resolve that had built his empire. "I've survived worse storms. And if anyone wants to walk away because I'm standing up for a boy's innocence, they were never worth doing business with in the first place." But behind closed doors, even Richard felt the pressure. The risk wasn't just to his reputation, it was reopening wounds he had tried for decades to bury. For Daniel, the weight grew unbearable. One night, he sat on the porch steps, his shoulders slumped, eyes fixed on the cracked sidewalk. "What if they never believe me?" he murmured to Emily, who sat cross-legged beside him. She reached for his hand, her small fingers curling around his. "Then I'll believe you enough for everyone, and someday they'll see they were wrong." Her words steadied him, but the storm was only intensifying. The evidence against him seemed to multiply as quickly as the doubts around him. The fight for truth was no longer just about clearing his name. It was about surviving a system determined to break him. The tension in town had grown so thick it seemed to hang in the air, heavy and unshakable. People spoke less to the Carters, their once friendly nods replaced by guarded glances. Daniel carried the weight of it everywhere, but Emily, small as she was, refused to shrink beneath it. It started at a community meeting held in the old town hall. Residents packed the creaking wooden benches, their voices rising as they debated safety, justice, and whether criminal behavior was taking root in their quiet streets. Though no one said Daniel's name outright, everyone knew who the conversation circled around. Linda had taken Emily along, hoping her daughter would sit quietly by her side. But as the discussion grew sharper, Emily's little hands balled into fists, her chest rising with indignation. Finally, when one man loudly declared, "Kids like that Carter boy ruin this town's reputation," Emily stood up. Her voice was high but strong. "That's not true." The room went silent, startled by the interruption. Linda reached for her daughter's hand, whispering urgently, "Emily, sit down." But Emily pulled free, her eyes blazing with determination. "You're all wrong about my brother," she continued, her small figure trembling but unyielding. "Daniel didn't steal anything. He works harder than anyone I know. He takes care of me when Mom is tired. He helps with homework even when he's falling asleep. He's the best brother in the whole world, and he would never, ever do what you're saying." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some looked away, ashamed, others frowned unmoved. But Emily pressed on, her voice catching as tears welled in her eyes. "If you all really knew him, you'd believe in him too. But you don't, because it's easier to believe a lie than to listen to the truth." Her words cut through the room sharper than any adult speech could have. People shifted in their seats, uncomfortable. The man who had spoken earlier cleared his throat, muttering, "She's just a kid." Emily snapped back, "Being a kid doesn't mean I don't know right from wrong, and it doesn't mean I can't see when people are being unfair." Silence followed, heavy and unbroken. Even Linda, stunned, had no words. Richard, who had been standing near the back, stepped forward slowly, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak, but the faintest nod in Emily's direction carried more weight than anything he could have said. When the meeting finally ended, the crowd filed out more subdued than they had entered. Whispers still followed the Carters, but they carried less venom now, softened by the memory of a child's raw defense of her brother. Outside, Linda crouched down, her hands on Emily's shoulders. "Sweetheart, you were so brave in there, but you scared me half to death." Emily sniffled, brushing at her damp cheeks. "I had to say something, Mom. They were lying about Danny, and if nobody else was going to tell the truth, then I had to." Daniel, who had waited anxiously at home, listened wide-eyed as Emily recounted the moment. His throat tightened, and he pulled her into a hug. "You shouldn't have had to do that," he murmured into her hair. She hugged him back fiercely. "Yes, I did, because you're my brother, and you'd do the same for me." Her simple words struck him harder than any insult the town had thrown his way. In her eyes, he wasn't a suspect or a pariah. He was her hero. And though Daniel still feared the trial ahead, something inside him shifted. If Emily could stand tall against a room full of doubters, then maybe he could stand tall against the courtroom too. Her courage didn't erase the storm around them, but it pierced the darkness with a light that refused to go out. The weeks leading up to the trial were merciless. Every day seemed to strip another layer of strength from the Carters. Linda, already stretched thin, began to falter under the weight of exhaustion. She worked long shifts, worried endlessly about her son, and tried to shield Emily from the bitterness of gossip. But even the strongest foundations can crack. One evening, as Daniel returned home from a meeting with Sarah, he found his mother sitting slumped in the armchair, her face pale and drawn. The television flickered soundlessly in the background, but Linda's eyes were closed, her chest rising and falling unevenly. Panic surged through him. "Mom!" Daniel rushed to her side, shaking her gently. Her eyes fluttered open, and she forced a weary smile. "I'm fine, sweetheart, just tired." But the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Emily appeared from the hallway, clutching a blanket. "She almost fainted earlier," she whispered fearfully. "I told her to sit down." Daniel's heart clenched. He knew his mother had been pushing herself beyond her limits, but seeing her like this made the consequences real. For the first time, he realized how much of the family's survival rested on her shoulders, and how much of a toll it had taken. "I'll take care of things," he said firmly. "You need to rest." Linda tried to protest, but the words faltered. She leaned back, defeated, her hand reaching for Daniel's. "I just don't want to fail you. Either of you." "You haven't failed us," Daniel replied, his voice thick. "You're the only reason we've made it this far." Yet the burden didn't ease. At school, Daniel continued to face sneers and whispers. At home, bills piled higher. And in the community, pressure grew on Richard too. A local newspaper ran a story questioning his motives, calling his support of Daniel a convenient way to rewrite his own past. Business partners from the city urged him to cut ties, warning that his reputation was at stake. Richard responded coldly to their concerns, but behind closed doors, even he showed strain. One night, after a long meeting with Sarah, he admitted quietly to Daniel, "I underestimated how far people will go to protect a lie, and how quickly they'll turn on anyone who challenges it." Daniel studied the man who had once seemed unshakable, and for the first time he saw the weight Richard carried. "Why don't you walk away?" Daniel asked. "It would be easier." Richard's jaw tightened. "Because I know what it feels like when everyone walks away. I won't do that to you." Despite the support, despair crept in. Sarah uncovered inconsistencies in the prosecution's case, missing logs, contradictory witness statements, but nothing strong enough to guarantee victory. The system felt rigged, stacked against a boy from a poor family. Late one night, Daniel sat on the porch steps, his head in his hands. Emily slipped out quietly, sitting beside him with a flashlight and a book clutched to her chest. "You shouldn't be out here," he muttered, his voice heavy. She shrugged. "I wanted to read to you. It helps me when I'm scared." Opening the worn book, she began to read aloud, her voice soft but steady. Daniel listened, the words washing over him, a fragile comfort against the darkness pressing in. When she finished, she looked at him earnestly. "You can't give up, Danny. If you give up, then they win. And you promised me you'd always protect me." "This time I think I have to protect you." Her words struck deep, reminding Daniel of the responsibility he carried, not just to clear his own name, but to stand strong for the sister who believed in him more than anyone else. But as the trial loomed closer, the family was running on fumes. Their strength, their hope, their unity, all were being tested to the breaking point. The day of the trial arrived beneath grey skies that threatened rain. For Daniel, the air itself felt heavy, as if the world had decided to mirror the weight pressing down on him. He walked into the courthouse beside Sarah and Richard, his mother and Emily trailing close behind. Every step echoed like a reminder of what was at stake. Inside, the courtroom was crowded. Neighbors filled the benches, their faces a blend of curiosity, judgment, and pity. Daniel avoided their eyes, focusing instead on the polished wood of the floor. Emily squeezed his hand before he sat at the defense table, whispering fiercely, "You're going to be okay." Sarah adjusted her files, her expression sharp, her voice calm. "Remember, Daniel, speak only when you're asked. I'll do the talking, trust me." The prosecution wasted no time painting Daniel as guilty. They presented the footprints, the witness statements, and the missing equipment as though it all fit neatly into place. The foreman, Mr. Davis, testified with a firm voice, claiming he had left Daniel to finish closing up. No one else had access, he insisted. If the tools disappeared, it had to be him. Daniel's fists tightened beneath the table, but Sarah's hand on his arm steadied him. When it was her turn, she rose with quiet confidence. "Mr. Davis," she began, her tone polite but cutting, "can you explain why your timesheet shows you stayed later that evening than you originally told the police?" A murmur ran through the courtroom. Davis hesitated, clearing his throat. Must have been a mistake in the logs. Sarah leaned closer, her eyes locked on him. "Or maybe not a mistake. Maybe you stayed because you had business with that equipment before anyone else discovered it was gone." The judge banged his gavel for order as whispers rose. Sarah pressed forward, pulling out copies of the foreman's loan records. "You were behind on payments, weren't you? Thousands of dollars overdue, and the missing equipment just happened to match what could fetch a high price on the secondary market." Davis's face flushed, but he shook his head. "That doesn't prove anything. Anyone could have taken it." "Except you testified no one else had access," Sarah countered smoothly. "So which is it, Mr. Davis? Did Daniel have sole access, or did others? You can't have it both ways." The jury shifted uncomfortably, their eyes narrowing with doubt. For the first time, Daniel saw cracks forming in the wall of accusations. But the prosecution wasn't finished. They brought in the neighbor who claimed to have seen Daniel at midnight near the site. The woman spoke firmly. "I know what I saw. Tall boy, same build, same hair, it was him." Daniel wanted to shout that she was wrong, that she couldn't possibly know in the dark, but Sarah rose again, her voice sharp. "Mrs. Porter, can you confirm the streetlight nearest the site was working that night?" The woman faltered. I'm not sure." Sarah stepped closer. "Records show that light was out for weeks, awaiting repair. So tell us, in the dark of midnight, how certain are you that the person you saw was Daniel Carter?" The witness stammered, her confidence unraveling. The doubt was palpable, spreading across the room like wildfire. Throughout it all, Richard remained silent, his gaze steady on Daniel, as though anchoring him through the storm. Emily clutched Linda's hand, her eyes wide, soaking in every word. By the time Sarah sat down, the room no longer hummed with certainty. Instead, it buzzed with questions that hadn't been there before. Daniel exhaled slowly, his pulse pounding. For the first time since his arrest, he felt the scales begin to shift. The battle wasn't over, but for once hope seemed stronger than fear. The final day of the trial arrived, and with it came a silence heavier than any words could carry. The courthouse was packed to the brim, every seat filled, every corner crowded with townspeople leaning forward, waiting to see how the story would end. Daniel sat at the defense table, his palms slick with sweat, his chest tight with nerves. Emily sat just behind him, her small hands folded in prayer, her lips moving silently. The judge entered, gavel in hand, and the courtroom rose in unison. Every sound seemed magnified, the scrape of shoes, the rustle of paper, the quiet clearing of throats. Sarah sat tall, her files neatly stacked, her expression calm. Richard's presence beside the family was as steady as a mountain, though his jaw was clenched with restrained tension. When the jury filed back in, Daniel's heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst. The foreman held a folded slip of paper, his face unreadable. Time slowed as he handed it to the bailiff, who then passed it to the judge. "On the charge of theft," the judge read aloud, his voice echoing through the chamber, "we, the jury, find the defendant, Daniel Carter." A pause, long enough to stretch like an eternity. "Not guilty." The words exploded through the room like thunder. Gasps, murmurs, even shouts filled the air. Daniel blinked, unable to process what he had just heard. His chest rose sharply as if he had been holding his breath for weeks and could finally inhale again. Emily leapt to her feet, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I told you!" she cried, her voice breaking with joy. Linda pulled her into a tight embrace, sobbing into her daughter's hair. Sarah exhaled slowly, a small smile tugging at her lips as she leaned toward Daniel. Justice, Daniel. "You earned it." Richard placed a firm hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You stood tall, son. You never let them break you. Don't forget this moment." Across the room, Mr. Davis sat pale and sweating, his composure unraveling. The murmurs of the crowd turned on him now, whispers of doubt and anger shifting blame where it belonged. Though no handcuffs were placed on him that day, his reputation lay shattered in a way no court could repair. Daniel stood on unsteady legs, his vision blurred with tears. He turned to his mother and sister, pulling them close. "It's over," he whispered, almost disbelieving. "It's finally over." The walk out of the courthouse felt entirely different from the one that had brought him in. Instead of whispers heavy with suspicion, the crowd parted with tentative nods, some even offering quiet apologies. A few voices called out, "We were wrong," though the sting of their earlier judgment lingered in Daniel's chest. Outside, the air felt fresher than it had in months. Emily clung to his arm, smiling through her tears. "See, Danny. I told you they'd see the truth." He knelt down, hugging her tightly. "You were right, Em. You were always right." Linda's eyes shone as she placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've carried more than anyone your age should ever have to, but you never gave up. I'm so proud of you." For the first time in what felt like forever, Daniel allowed himself to believe in tomorrow. The scars of the trial would remain, people would still talk, and trust would take time to rebuild, but the burden of guilt was gone. He was free, and with that freedom came a chance to start again. As they walked toward Richard's car, the older man lingered for a moment, watching the family with an expression both solemn and hopeful. When Daniel turned, their eyes met. Richard gave a faint nod as if to say, "This was your fight, but now it's your future." Daniel nodded back, the weight of the past months finally lifting from his shoulders. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time, the road ahead seemed open. The morning after the verdict, the Carter house felt lighter, as if the walls themselves had released a breath they had been holding. For the first time in months, laughter returned to the kitchen. Emily skipped between the table and the counter, humming to herself as Linda poured coffee. Daniel sat with a plate of toast, still struggling to grasp the new reality. "It feels strange," he admitted quietly, buttering the bread with slow, deliberate strokes. "Like I'm free, but I keep expecting someone to knock on the door and take it all back." Linda reached across the table, her tired eyes warm with pride. "That won't happen. It's over, Daniel. The world knows the truth now, and so do you." Emily plopped into the chair beside him, swinging her legs. "You don't have to worry anymore. You can think about the future again." The future. The word lingered in Daniel's mind. For so long, his only focus had been survival, getting through one more day under suspicion. Now, suddenly, the horizon stretched open. And though scars remained, possibility began to seep in. Later that week, Richard visited them one last time before returning to the city. He stood on the porch, his expression serious but gentler than when they first met. "You've got a second chance, Daniel," he said. "Don't waste it. Use it to build the life you want, not the one people tried to pin on you." Daniel nodded, his voice steady. "I will. And thank you. Not just for the lawyer, but for believing me when no one else did." Richard's gaze softened, a flicker of emotion passing across his features. "Believing you was the easy part. Believing in myself again, that's what you gave me." The two shook hands, a bond formed not by blood or obligation, but by shared wounds and the determination to rise above them. As Richard's car pulled away, Emily waved enthusiastically, calling out, "Come back soon." He smiled faintly through the window before disappearing down the street. In the weeks that followed, life slowly regained rhythm. Some neighbors apologized awkwardly, though others avoided eye contact, unwilling to confront their own prejudice. Daniel learned to accept both responses. He had no energy left for bitterness. What mattered most was the family who had never wavered, and the unexpected allies who had stood by him when the world turned away. One evening, sitting outside with Emily, Daniel watched the sunset paint the sky in strokes of orange and pink. The cicadas hummed, the air warm and thick with summer's end. Emily leaned against him, her voice soft. "Do you think people will ever forget what they said about you?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, then shook his head. "No, but that doesn't matter. What matters is that I didn't let it define me, and that you never stopped believing." She smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "Because you're my brother, and brothers don't give up." Linda joined them on the porch, carrying 3 glasses of iced tea. She handed one to Daniel, her eyes filled with quiet strength. "We're still standing," she said simply. "And that's enough." Daniel looked at them both, feeling a swell of gratitude that words couldn't capture. The trial had taken so much from them, but it had also revealed something deeper, the unshakable bond of a family that refused to break. As night settled in, Daniel realized their story wasn't about defeat or accusation anymore. It was about resilience, about finding light in the darkest corners, about a little girl's courage, a mother's endurance, and a stranger's decision to stand against injustice. And as this chapter closes, we invite you to carry that message with you. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful journeys of hope and redemption. And before you go, click on the video suggested on your screen right now. You won't want to miss what comes next.